All right, let's solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. Now remember, a quadratic equation is a polynomial to the second degree. All right, so we're going to start with this one, and I'm going to remind you that the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, a, b, and c in this formula come from the coefficients of your x terms and your constant. In other words, for this equation, a is equal to 3, b is equal to negative 8, and c is equal to 1. In order to use the quadratic formula, you have to have your polynomial written in descending order so that you can identify a, b, and c correctly. All right, so here's my a, b, and c. I'm just going to plug them in. All right, so x equals negative 8. You see this is my negative, and then b, plus or minus my square root of negative 8 squared minus 4 times 3 times 1, all over 2a, which is 3. 2 times 3. All right, well, when I do the math, then negative 8 is just positive 8, plus or minus the square root of negative 8 squared, the negative sign goes away, I get 64, minus 12, all over 6. Now this is 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 12 is 52 over 6. Now, the square root of 52 can be simplified. So one of the things that you have to be able to do when you're solving a quadratic using the quadratic formula is you have to be able to simplify your square roots. So we have 8 plus or minus. Now, 4 times 13 gives me 52. So I can take the square root of 4, that's a 2, and then I have the square root of 13 left. One more thing I need to do is I need to reduce my fraction. So I can see that I can factor a 2 out of the numerator. All right. And when I factor a 2 out, I have 4 left here, and then plus or minus, and then just the square root of 13 left here, over 6. Now you always want to factor before you start canceling things. All right. Let's write that up here where we can see it a little better. 4 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 6. Now, once I have it factored, then I can reduce by canceling my factors. You can only cancel factors, don't forget that. So, my answer then is 4 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 3. When you solve a quadratic equation, you always get 2 answers. Now, they're not always 2 different answers like these two. Sometimes you get a repeated answer, and sometimes you get an imaginary answer. We're going to have one of those in a minute. Now, let's solve another one. All right, so we're going to erase this and do another one. And I'll erase my quadratic formula, but I'm going to write the quadratic formula again right up here so that we have it to look at. Now you need to know the quadratic formula. This is going to be a very important tool that you'll use a lot. All right, so there's my quadratic formula. Here's a second example. All right, we're going to solve the equation 2x squared minus x equals 3. Now, the first thing that you have to do before you start solving any quadratic is make sure that everything is on the same side of the equal sign and 0 is on the other side. So I'm going to have to subtract 3 from both sides, and then I have 2x squared minus x minus 3 equals 0. Now I can start solving my quadratic. So a is 2, b is negative 1, c is negative 3. So I'm going to plug those into my quadratic formula. Negative b, well, b is negative 1, plus or minus the square root of b, which is negative 1 squared, b squared, minus 4 times a is 2, times c is negative 3, all over 2 times 2, which is 4. All right, so we're going to go ahead and do the math to simplify this. So negative 1 is really positive 1, and then plus or minus the square root of 1, and then this is minus negative 24. Well, minus a negative is really a positive, so it's plus 24, and it's all over 4. Well, this is 1 plus or minus the square root of 25 over 4. Well, I can take the square root of 25. And the square root of 25 is 5, so I've got 1 plus or minus 5 over 4. So what I have then is two answers, 1 plus 5 over 4, which is 6 over 4, which is 3/2. And yes, you need to separate these out and do the math because it can be done. In the last one, we had a square root that prevented us from going any further with our math, but we don't this time. And the second answer is 1 minus 5 over 4, which is negative 4 over 4, which is negative 1. So my two answers are 3/2 and negative 1. What this means, answers without square roots mean that we could have actually solved this equation by factoring. All right, let's do one more. Now, if you have not had any experience with imaginary numbers, you're going to have a hard time following some of this last example. So if you're only in an Algebra 1 class, you probably haven't had a discussion on imaginary numbers yet, and this is not a good example for you. All right, so x squared minus x plus 7 equals 0. Now, normally when we solve quadratic equations, if they're simple enough, we'll factor them because that's an easy thing to do. This one is a simple equation, but it's not factorable, so I have to use the quadratic formula. All right, so x equals negative 1. b is negative 1. Plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared minus 4 times 1, which is a, times 7. All over 2 times 1. Well, when I do the math here, I get positive 1 here, but under my square root sign, I've got 1, negative 1 squared is positive 1, minus 28. So you see, we're going to have a little problem right here. We're going to end up with a negative number under my square root sign. All right, so like I said, this is going to be an imaginary number. So we can write this as 1 plus or minus the square root of 27i over 2. All right, I need to simplify my square root of 27. So that's going to be 1 plus or minus, now 27 is 9 times 3. I can take the square root of 9. The square root of 9 is 3, so I'm going to pull that out. I'm going to have the 3 left in there, and then I over 2. The standard way to write a complex number is the real part and then the imaginary part. Right now they're kind of all put together, so I need to separate them. So I'm going to separate them into 1/2, that's my real part, and then plus or minus 3/2, or 3 square root of 3/2, and then I. This is how we would typically write an answer that is a complex number.